how I bought the Bloody Butcher back in '77. Man, just saying those words makes my skin crawl. You look at me now, sitting here in this cramped city apartment with the hum of the refrigerator being the only thing I have to listen to, and you see a man who jumps at the sound of a vacuum cleaner. But back then, back in the late '70s, I was a different breed. I was a Kansas farmer, third generation, with dirt under my fingernails and a mountain of debt on my shoulders that felt heavier than a silo full of wet grain. The mid-'70s were a strange time in the Midwest. We were stuck between the old world and the new. My father had left me the land, but he'd left it tired. The soil was exhausted, the prices were dropping, and the machinery. God, the machinery was a joke. We were running an old beat-up John Deere that coughed more blue smoke than it did grain. Every time I turned the key, I prayed to a God I hadn't spoken to in years just to let the manifold stay in one piece. If I didn't get the harvest in that year, the bank, those suit-and-tie sharks out in Wichita, were going to take the house, the barns, and every memory of my old man. I was desperate, and in the heartland, desperation is a scent the predators can smell from 3 counties away. It smells like sweat and stale coffee. I remember the day I saw the ad. It was a Tuesday, stiflingly hot. The kind of heat that makes the horizon shimmer like a lake of oil. I was sitting at the kitchen table, a half-eaten sandwich in front of me, leafing through the county ledger. I was looking for a miracle, and I found it tucked in the back, right next to a notice about a livestock auction. It was hand-scrawled, almost like the ink was shivering on the page. It read, "For sale, IH Axial-Flow 1460, like new, $4,000, cash only. See Silas Vane at the Old Hollow Road. Bring a trailer, come at night." Now, you have to understand, in 1977, the International Harvester Axial-Flow was the holy grail. It was the red beast. It was the first of the rotaries. It didn't just thresh. It changed the game. It was supposed to be the smoothest, most efficient machine ever built by human hands. A machine like that, barely used, should have cost me $40,000, maybe more. $4,000? That was a punchline. I thought I'd found my jackpot. I thought the universe had finally decided to stop kicking me while I was down. I didn't call. I didn't wait for morning. I grabbed the envelope of cash I'd been hiding under the floorboards, money meant for the taxes, and I threw it into the glove box of my Chevy. The drive out to Old Hollow Road took me 3 hours through the kind of darkness you only find in the plains. No streetlights, no houses, just the infinite wall of corn on either side of the gravel. When I finally found Silas Vane's place, my headlights hit something that made my stomach do a slow, sick roll. The farm didn't look like it had been hit by a storm or a drought. It looked like it had been cleansed. The barn was a hollow skeleton of gray wood. The fences weren't broken, they were simply gone, leaving nothing but the holes in the dirt where the posts used to be. It was just a flat, terrifying expanse of bare earth and a farmhouse with the windows boarded up with heavy plywood. Silas Vane was standing in the middle of that dirt lot. He wasn't wearing farm clothes. He was wearing an old stained suit that looked 2 sizes too big, and his skin was the color of a mushroom grown in a cellar. He was leaning against the most beautiful red machine I had ever seen. The 1460 sat there like a throne of steel, the red paint gleaming under the moon like a fresh scab. Silas didn't shake my hand. He didn't even look at the money when I handed it over. He just shoved the envelope into a coat pocket, handed me a heavy brass key, and pointed toward the road. "She's yours, Jack," he rasped. His voice sounded like 2 stones grinding together. "She's efficient. She's hungry. Just don't let her idle too long in the yard. She likes to keep moving." I was too blinded by the shine of that red paint to hear the warning in his voice. I hooked the beast to my trailer, winched it up, and drove home feeling like I'd just stolen fire from the gods. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, watching that massive red silhouette follow me through the dark. I felt powerful. I felt saved. But when I pulled into my yard at 4 in the morning, my neighbor, Old Man Miller, was standing by my gate. He was a veteran of the Korean War, a man who didn't scare easy, but when he saw that 1460, he turned a shade of white that I'll never forget. "Jack," he whispered, his voice trembling, "is that Vane's machine? Tell me you didn't buy that thing." "Got it for a steal, Miller," I bragged, patting the cold steel of the fender. This is going to save the farm." Miller didn't congratulate me. He just backed away, his eyes fixed on the grain intake. They say Silas didn't lose his herd to the fever jack. They say his whole farm just vanished in 48 hours. The cows, the pigs, even the barn cats. One day there was a farm, the next day there was Silas and that red devil. You don't harvest with a machine like that. You sacrifice to it. I laughed at him. I told him he'd spent too much time listening to ghost stories and not enough time checking his oil. I went to bed and dreamt of gold. I dreamt of endless piles of grain and a bank account that didn't have a negative sign in front of it. The next day, the heat was a physical weight. The air was thick with the smell of dry earth and the coming harvest. I spent the afternoon checking the fluids on the axial flow, but every time I opened a hatch, a strange sensation washed over me. It felt like the machine was breathing. Not the hot air of a Kansas summer, but a low, rhythmic pulse of air that felt humid and heavy. And then there was the smell. I climbed into the cab for the first time in the daylight. I shut the heavy pressurized door, expecting the scent of a new interior. Instead, I was hit by a stench so thick I nearly gagged. It didn't smell like diesel. It didn't smell like grease. It smelled like a slaughterhouse in the middle of a blackout. It was the smell of wet feathers, hot copper, and old, unwashed flannel shirts. It was the smell of a livestock pen that hadn't been mucked out in a decade, mixed with something sickly sweet, like rotting peaches. Probably just some dead mice in vents, I muttered to myself, though I didn't believe it. I cranked the windows open, but the smell didn't leave. It seemed to be coming from the very upholstery of the seat. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in colors of bruised purple and dried blood, I decided it was time. I couldn't wait another day. The bank was coming on Monday, and I had 40 acres of corn that needed to be in the truck tonight. I put on my hat, gripped that brass key, and climbed back into the red beast. I turned the ignition. The Axial-Flow didn't roar. Most engines of that size give you a high-pitched whine of the starter before the diesel kicks in. This one just moaned. It was a deep, guttural sound that started in the very frame of the machine and vibrated up through the floorboards, through my boots, and into my teeth. It felt like I was sitting on top of a massive, hibernating heart that had just been poked with a needle. I engaged the rotor, and the whole machine shivered with a violent, animalistic energy. I eased the hydro lever forward. The header, with its long, silver spinning teeth, dipped into the first row of my father's corn. The harvest had begun, but within the first 10 yards, I knew something was fundamentally wrong. The corn wasn't just being cut, it was being inhaled. The stalks didn't lean or snap. They disappeared into the intake with a frantic, desperate speed, as if the machine was starving. And the sound. God, the sound of the rotor wasn't the usual mechanical hum. It was a wet, rhythmic thud, thump, squelch, crack. It sounded like a giant was chewing on a mouthful of dry timber and wet laundry. I looked out the side window at the discharge chute, expecting a cloud of dust and husks. Instead, I saw a thick gray mist that looked like wood ash, heavy and damp, settling on the ground behind me. I looked behind me into the grain tank. In the dim, sickly green light of the cab's instrument panel, I saw the corn flowing in, but the tank was filling up at a rate that made no sense. I'd only been moving for 5 minutes, and the grain alarm was already screaming a high, piercing note. The tank was full. "How is that possible?" I whispered, my heart starting to hammer against my ribs. I steered the machine toward the grain truck, my hands slick with sweat on the wheel. Every time I hit a bump, the machine didn't rattle like metal. It felt soft, like I was driving over a mattress. I swung the unloading auger out, lined it up with the truck bed, and hit the switch. The first few seconds were golden, just pure, clean corn. But then, the flow stuttered. The auger let out a shriek that sounded like a woman screaming in a tunnel, and the grain changed. Out of that red pipe came a nightmare. Mixed with my golden corn were long, shredded strips of denim, the kind of tough fabric you find on overalls. Then came a flurry of white chicken feathers, thousands of them, matted together with a dark brownish slime that looked like clotted blood. I froze, my hand hovering over the kill switch as the discharge pipe vomited out a heavy, jagged slab of graying meat. Too big to be a steak, too irregular to be a roast. It looked like a side of pork that had been put through a wood chipper. And then, with a final heavy clunk, a brass door handle and a shattered pieces of a wooden porch railing flew out, burial shrouded in grain. The red beast wasn't just unloading my crop, it was emptying its stomach. It was purging the remains of the vein farm, the livestock, the house, the clothes, and God knows what else, right into my truck. I stared at the back of my truck, my breath hitching in my chest. The moon was high now, casting a pale, sickly glow over the mounds of corn, and what I saw there, it didn't belong in any harvest. Among the golden kernels were shredded pieces of a child's quilt, the faded blue floral pattern still visible under a layer of dark, sticky grease. I didn't think. I just reacted. I slammed the kill switch on the console. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, like a wet wool blanket dropped over my head. The 1460 didn't just stop, it sighed. A long, wheezing hiss of air escaped the grain tank, and for a second, I could swear I smelled Sunday roast and iron-rich blood. I climbed down the ladder, my knees knocking together like dry corn stalks in the wind. I grabbed my heavy mag light from the cab and stumbled over to the truck. My hands were shaking so bad I dropped the light twice before I could get a steady beam on the pile. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, I breathed. I reached in with a trembling hand and pulled out a heavy rusted cowbell. The leather strap had been chewed through, not by teeth, but by something mechanical, leaving jagged, serrated edges. Next to it was a man's leather work boot, size 11, completely hollow, but caked in a thick black sludge that didn't smell like oil. It smelled like the earth at the bottom of a grave. I didn't wait for morning. I ran back to the house, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, and dialed the county sheriff. Sheriff Higgins showed up 30 minutes later, his cruiser kicking up a wall of dust. He was a big man, a veteran of a dozen Kansas winters, but when he climbed up the side of my grain truck and shone his spotlight on the harvest, he turned a shade of white that looked like bone. "Jack," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "what in the hell did you buy?" "I bought a combine, Sheriff," I rasped, leaning against the cold metal of his fender. "I just bought a combine." He reached into the pile with a gloved hand and pulled out a silver locket. He clicked it open. Inside was a tiny, faded photograph of a young woman in a 1950s-style dress, smiling at a camera that no longer existed. The locket was dented, as if it had been squeezed in a giant's fist. The next 72 hours were a blur of flashing blue lights, men in white forensic coveralls, and the constant rhythmic thwack, thwack, thwack of a news chopper circling overhead. They treated my farm like a crime scene out of a horror movie. They backed the International Harvester into my machine shed and began what the lead investigator, a grim man named Miller, called a mechanical autopsy. I sat on my porch smoking through 3 packs of Marlboros, watching them pull the bloody butcher apart. Every time a technician stepped out of that shed, they looked like they'd seen the devil himself. By the second day, Miller walked up to my porch. He didn't have his usual clipboard. He had a clear plastic evidence bag. Inside was a set of dentures and a gold wedding band with an inscription, Silas and Martha, 1948. "We checked the serial numbers, Jack," Miller said, his voice flat. "This machine was reported stolen 6 months ago from a family farm 3 counties over. The owners? They vanished. The neighbors said they heard the machine running all night, but when the sun came up, the farmhouse was just gone. Just a flat patch of dirt where the porch used to be." I felt the blood drain from my face. Silas Vane hadn't just lost his farm. He had fed it to the machine. Every fence post, every pig in the pen, every memory he had, he'd processed it all through that red rotary heart. And when he ran out of things to feed it, he sold the hunger to me. The police went back to Old Hollow Road that afternoon. They found exactly what I feared. Silas Vane was gone. The $4,000 I'd given him was the blood money he'd used to buy a new life, leaving the ghosts of his old one in my grain truck. The story hit the national news by Friday. "The Bloody Butcher of Kansas," the headline screamed. People started calling my house, whispering threats, or just breathing heavily into the phone. I was the man who brought the meat grinder into the county. The bank didn't care about the ghosts. They didn't care about the feathers in the air intake or the meat in the auger. They still wanted their interest. But when the repo men showed up to take the 1460, The machine wouldn't budge. The engine wasn't seized. It was full. It sat in my shed, a 5-ton block of red-painted sin, smelling like a wet dog and a copper mine. Eventually, the state took it. They loaded it onto a heavy-duty flatbed under a black tarp. They said they were going to melt it down in a furnace in Kansas City to turn that cursed steel into rebar or manhole covers. But I still hear the stories. I hear about a mint condition 1460 showing up at night auctions in Iowa and Nebraska. I hear about farmers who find scraps of denim in their grain tanks and human hair in their sieves. I live in the city now. I don't touch dirt. I don't look at the classifieds. But sometimes when the wind blows from the west, I can still smell it. That thick copper scent of a harvest that never ends. And I know the butcher is still out there, somewhere in the dark, waiting for a man who's desperate enough to turn the key. I stood there in the mud, the silence of the Kansas night ringing in my ears like a gunshot. The red beast sat idling, a low, wet thrumming coming from its belly that felt less like a diesel engine and more like a purr. I climbed up the side of the grain truck, my flashlight beam cutting through the swirling dust and gnats, and that's when the world just stopped. It wasn't just corn. My beautiful golden harvest was drowning in a sea of shredded denim, white chicken feathers, and graying, fibrous meat. I reached in, my hand shaking so hard I nearly dropped the light. I pulled out a heavy leather work glove, the kind we all wore back then, but it was caked in a thick black sludge that smelled like a slaughterhouse floor. And inside the glove, there wasn't a hand, thank God, but it was stuffed tight with dried corn husks and copper pennies. I dug deeper, driven by a sick kind of curiosity, and pulled out a braided rug, or what was left of one, all tangled up in the grain. "Silas," I whispered, the name tasting like ash. "What did you do?" I didn't wait for an answer from the wind. I jumped down, ran to the cab, and ripped the door open. That smell, that thick, suffocating stench of hog-wild musk and wet laundry, hit me like a physical wall. I reached for the radio, thinking maybe I could hear a human voice, but all that came out of the speakers was a wet, rhythmic slapping sound. Schlick, 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 like a heavy blade hitting a wet stump. I called the county sheriff from the wall phone in the barn, my voice cracking like a dry stick. When Sheriff Higgins pulled up in his old Plymouth, the light bar splashing blue and red across the corn, he looked like he'd aged 10 years since the last time I saw him at the diner. He climbed up that truck, took one look at the feathers and the pork-colored gristle mixed with my grain, and he turned a shade of green I didn't think a man could turn. "Jack," he said, pulling his handkerchief over his nose, "stay back. Don't touch a damn thing." The next few days were a blur of 80s grit. The State Bureau of Investigation showed up in those tan sedans, men in cheap suits and aviator glasses walking through my dirt like it was a graveyard. They hauled the Axial-Flow into my machine shed and draped it in black plastic. They called it the Bloody Butcher. By the third day, the lead investigator, a guy who looked like he'd been born in a police station, sat me down on my porch. He opened a manila folder and showed me photos of the Vane farm, or what was left of it. It wasn't just the house that was gone. The soil itself had been scalped. He told me they found spectacles, wedding bands, and bone fragments deep in the secondary sieves of my new combine. "Silas Vane didn't lose his farm to the bank, Jack," the investigator said, his voice cold as a January frost. "He fed it to the rotor, the livestock, the furniture, the fences. And we haven't found Silas yet. Or his wife. All we found was that 1460 sitting in the dark, waiting for someone to buy it." The news went national. I was the farmer of the damned. People from Wichita drove out just to throw stones at my fence. I couldn't sell the corn. Nobody wanted butcher grain. I couldn't sell the land. The soil felt wrong under your boots, like it was waiting for you to trip so it could swallow you too. The police eventually took the machine away on a lowboy trailer, heading for a scrapyard in Kansas City to be melted down into nothing. But the rumors never died. To this day, guys in the Midwest talk about a red beast that shows up in the classifieds for $4,000 cash. They say the cab always smells like wet wool and old blood, and the rotor never clogs no matter what you feed it. I lost the farm. I lost my father's legacy. I live in a brick apartment now, 3 stories up, as far away from a cornfield as I can get. But sometimes, when the city gets real quiet at 3 in the morning, I can still hear that low, rhythmic thudding. Thump, squelch, crack. I know the butcher is still out there. It's sitting in a shed somewhere, its red paint gleaming like a fresh wound, waiting for a man who's broke, desperate, and looking for a miracle. And when he turns that key, God help him, because the harvest is never just about the grain. It's about the meat.